Hello, my name is Beth Kelly, and I'm the Vice President for Education, Research, and Interpretation at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Thank you for joining us for Us, Past, Present, Future, a series designed to generate conversations around issues that are important to all of us. As citizens, it's important that we look at the promises that were made at the founding of our nation and have conversations when those promises are unfulfilled. Residents, not citizens, will take us on a journey with the Black community here in Williamsburg. Currently, I am in one of our exhibition spaces, the quarters and kitchen that is located behind the home of Peyton and Betty Randolph. It is a space that is similarly found in most households in the 18th century here in Williamsburg. In this space, only the enslaved members of the household would gather, perhaps after a long day of work. You may have seen Aggie in here, hugging her child for the first time that day. Or perhaps Cordia, singing a hymn. Or maybe even Johnny, reflecting on actions that happened to him, or perhaps to those that he loved, that reminded him of his condition and the horrors of enslavement. For generations, our Black community has had to find spaces like this where they could be themselves, in their own homes, in their church, or schools. I wonder if our community is all that different from your community. Our panelists join us from Brewton Heights School, a school that was built for the Black community at a time when public education was racially segregated. For a quarter of a century, the school had students and educated only the Black community. Up until the late 1960s, when the school and school systems were desegregated, the school became then a community center, and now today, it houses the corporate offices for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. History is about people. Our panelists tonight will take you on a journey about our community, but it is our hope that you will enter into this conversation and take the conversation into your own community. This is, in fact, our shared past. Our past is not segregated by gender or by ethnicity or by race. It is our past. And it's important when factors arise within our present that we look at those founding promises and determine together how we can fulfill them for our shared future. Thank you again for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for Us, Past, Present, and Future, a CW conversation, residents, not citizens, a journey of the Black community in Williamsburg from its founding through today. I'm your host, Hope Wright, and we are coming to you today from Lane Auditorium at Brewton Heights School. It was the only school for Williamsburg's Black students during segregation, but it also served as a community center as well. I am joined by our panel today, Janice Canaday, Bobby Braxton, and Brian Smalls. If you all will please introduce yourselves. I'll start with you, Ms. Janice.
Good afternoon. I'm Janice Canaday. I am a lifetime resident in Williamsburg. I have worked at Colonial Williamsburg for over 22 years, and I've had the good fortune to raise a family of 6 children here as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert A. Bobby Braxton, and I'm a lifetime resident of Williamsburg with the exception of the time that I left in 1956, graduating from the school in which we were being broadcast from and coming back 40 years later to retire in my hometown.
I'm Brian Smalls. While I wasn't born here, I was here the majority of my life since the age of 2, so I feel like a lifelong resident.
Well, we are going to cover a lot of history in this first segment of our program to gain an understanding of the establishment and the development of the Black community in Williamsburg. Ms. Janice, can you tell us about the 18th century history of the Black community here?
Well, in the 18th century, Williamsburg was the capital city for the colony of Virginia. And Virginia stretched at the time from sea to sea. So you're talking about a town that's going to be the epitome of religion and politics, social times as well, where you had a population of less than 2,000 people. and 52.4% of that population were the enslaved. You had about maybe a little less than 24 free blacks here. So they would have been here in this town where some of your most prominent leaders will attend the College of Women Mary. So this was a happening place with a lot going on. And those enslaved folks and the free blacks here were trying to find a way to encourage those people around them who made the laws, who were in power, to see them as whole human beings.
Thank you. Now, some of you all here today, you can trace your families back to this community. Can each one of you talk a little bit about your family connections here to the area? I'll start with you again, Ms. Janice.
Well, in trying to trace my family, I found that I'd get a little bit of an opening and run up against the wall. So I had to figure out ways to go around the wall or through the wall, and that's not always easy to do with what's available to you. It's really hard to trace the lineage of your family when the law or people's intentions don't keep up with records. When you're looking for tax records or land deeds or wills, things of that sort that aren't always available like they are for other folks. So you really have to find a different way to do your tracing, another way to seek the evidence that you're looking for. On my mother's side, on my mother's father's side, I've traced my great-grandfather, Anthony Brown, and his wife, Rachel Brown. They were freed by Ludwell Lee in 1806, and they were probably the first free black settlement here at that time. And on my mother's father's side, there's also Hannah Shepherd, who goes back to the 1700s.
Wow. Thank you. Bobby, can you speak to that a little for us, please?
Well, mine actually concerns attempting to trace back from the patriarchal side. And because the matriarchal side really ended up in many cases being rather easy. But the patriarchal side, I ran into a problem when it came to my great-grandfather because I could never figure out where he came from. And what happened, the Braxtons had a reunion, I believe, and many years ago, and an Indian lady came there saying that I think I can help you find where your great-grandfather came from. And lo and behold, she told us that our family descended from Carter Braxton under the same auspices, she figured, as Thomas Jefferson's Sally Heming area. And from there, we took off. And right now, I'm attempting to document some of that information, which, listening to Janice, are running into the same hurdles, even though we think we found a way there.
And Brian, I know you're not from the area, but can you talk a little bit about your family's lineage and history?
Sure, yeah. So on, I don't know a lot about my mother's side. I know that some of the family came out of Southampton County, made their way to, Warwick County, which is now Newport News. But most of the history I know about my family is on my dad's side. So my father's from Georgetown, South Carolina. And for those of you, who are into history, the three ports that had the most slaves come into them were Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Georgetown, South Carolina. And so much of my history traces right back to, the rice plantations there in Georgetown, South Carolina. And to Janice's point earlier, there have been issues just trying to, find information because as African Americans, we oftentimes do run up against walls, okay? I believe the first census that you see black people in is around 1870. And so, anything prior to that, it's going to be a challenge to try to be able to use those. We didn't own property. In fact, we were property. So, I mean, when you consider it from, that vantage point, you can see why many black people in this country, and especially those here in Williamsburg, have issues as far as trying to, be able to tell, exactly what the family history is.
Now, Brian, you're actually in a really unique position to speak to that. As a state attorney, we talked about some of those limitations in the 18th century, but all the way up to redlining and other Jim Crow policies. Can you talk a little bit about how that impacts black families, not only in being able to trace descendants, but also their ability to pass wealth and a legacy from one generation to the next?
Sure, yes. So, I mean, when we talk about generational wealth, Black people in this country are, kind of playing from behind, because for so long we couldn't own property. Like I said earlier, we were property.
Absolutely.
And so it kind of put us behind the 8 ball. So, you're kind of trying to catch up. But as a result of that, you find yourselves, or find ourselves in a situation where, just historically, we've just been disadvantaged in many respects. Now, we made tremendous progress over the years. To be able to sit here and have this conversation, I think definitely shows that has been the case. But when you start getting into the historical disadvantages, the redlining where, Black people couldn't get loans to buy real estate in their neighborhoods because financial institutions refused to lend to people that lived in certain areas of town. And then when you consider the fact that even when we do own property, the value of our property is devalued. I think it was in 2018, the Brookings Institute had a study that they did where they looked at Black wealth, home ownership, okay, which is typically what people's primary wealth is in their homes. When they looked at primarily Black neighborhoods, the value in those neighborhoods was devalued, okay, to the tune of, I think it was about $156 billion.
Wow.
Okay? So if you consider $156 billion is being taken out of these African-American Black neighborhoods across the country, that's businesses that can't be started. That's colleges that your education can't have the education because, you don't have that wealth built into, the equity that's in the homes. And so as a result of that, it's just an example of why even today, many policies that have just kind of been pervasive have kept African Americans from being able to build wealth in this country.
It's powerful and impactful. We're going to move the discussion a little bit forward to Reconstruction. So we're talking specifically about the time in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. By now, enslaved people have been freed a lot in this area because depending upon where you are in Virginia, you would or would not be underneath the Emancipation Proclamation due to gain your freedom. And then the 13th Amendment, which I encourage everyone to read clearly and look at what it does exactly say and what it doesn't say. But essentially, after a period of time when you have formerly enslaved people who are now free. What do we know? Are there any specific stories or instances that anybody on the panel would like to share about those free and enslaved or formerly enslaved Black families in the Reconstruction era? How were they doing? What was their experience like? I'll start with you, Ms. Janice.
Well, you think about what are they after during that period of Reconstruction when they are emancipated. You got people who've never been free who don't know how to be free. Got white folks around them that are not used to free people being there that they used to own and control. So everybody's having a problem. But for the enslaved folks who are now free, they're smart enough to want education. They're also making strides because you'll see that eventually they're participating in politics and they're running for offices. They're creating businesses. So these are not people who are just sitting down waiting for somebody to come and get them and give them a leg up. They are motivated and moving forward and pressing forward. And collectively, they help each other to move forward. What they're being denied from the environment and the people around them, they create for their own selves. So they're always fixing and helping each other to fix. So if you don't have, then I'm going to find a way to have and share. They're getting their hands on land. This is an agricultural place that we're living in. And so the farming has always been a big deal. So everybody's grabbing land if they can, and they're farming and they're selling. And so they're using their resources to pull themselves up and to create a community that's going to be progressive and successful, and they do just that.
Bobby, did you want to add anything?
No, I can't add too much to that from my side, because what happens in the reconstructive era of my family just dates back to, say, early 1800s. And I don't have that much information there, except, as I mentioned before, my great-grandfather, patriotically. But matriotically, yes, there is quite a bit. Matter of fact, my great-grandfather ran for, what did they call it, a representative in Warwick County. And doing some more digging in his information, and his name was James Fields. And there's a house in Newport News dedicated to him called the James Fields House. This gentleman had racehorses, he had farms, and he would travel to Richmond periodically at least 2 to 3 times a week. And you imagine the time we're talking. And so his brothers actually one went to Stanford and became a lawyer. And so during after that, in Reconstruction, I get a little lost, and my other relatives have more detailed information about what happened there. But I just concern myself right now with the patriarchal side. But matriarchally, very well done for them.
Now, we've heard a lot from one another, but we also would like to bring our audience into the conversation now. Our first viewer question comes from Jeanette. And Jeanette would like to know, how could the lives of Black people be better represented in Colonial Williamsburg?
Better represented.
There we go.
Well, by telling the whole story and by telling a truthful story. Black folks were everywhere here.
Yeah.
They weren't on the outskirts of town. This was a black town with white folks in it, if the truth be told. And there's no discipline that they didn't impact. So from the trades to even with Sam Harris, who was here, who was a stockholder in the first bank here, Peninsula Bank, Black folks have been making strides. So we have to unpack our history. Our history is so rich and so full, and we've contributed so much to not just Williamsburg, but the whole nation. And so if you were really to tell and build the foundation that we're supposed to be on, it's phenomenal. So we just have to have people who are willing to tell the truth, courageous enough to hear the stories, and accept the fact that it's not reducing you, but it's elevating those folks who've been reduced and erased, those hidden figures, and bringing their contributions to life so that the other part of the community here, who've never heard anything positive about themselves, but everything negative. So that the young folks here who are going to be the legacy for everybody, doesn't matter whether you're white, black, or whoever, we have to find a way to empower those children and give them a reason to hope and aspire to be more than what society says they should be. And that's by telling them their truth. We don't have to make it up. We don't have to write it. We just have to tell them what simply has been and still is.
Absolutely.
Right. Absolutely, I will agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, going back to Sam Harris, I found one other thing about Sam Harris is that William and Mary was in trouble at one point in history, and Sam Harris loaned them the money to stay open.
Wow.
You have to hesitate about 5 seconds with that one. Also, a journalist who's done some work on historical Williamsburg, the city itself, he found out that there had been 13 black mayors in Williamsburg. And this is when I was on city council, and I thought that I was the second city councilman. Russell Tabb was first. I was second, but there were the other 13. I also found out, and the same journalist gave me an ad showing where my great-grandfather here ran for city council. Wow. No one ever told me anything about that.
Wow. Wow, and that's part of what you said, Ms. Janice.
Yeah.
We need to tell these stories and share these stories. I have another question from Kelly. Kelly would like to know, are there known current-day Williamsburg residents of color who have been able to trace their lineages to colonial era residents of color?
Well, it wouldn't be hard it wouldn't be hard to do. If just Williamsburg, for me, if you just look at the surnames of the black folks who are still here, the folks that are here, their families, their descendants were here in the 18th century, and we know how they got here. And so they don't leave. They stay here and go on and create a life. When the government moves to Richmond, folks of this town dies out. And I've heard folks say, oh, nothing was going on here. This was a sleepy little town. There was a lot going on here. Because the folks were here moved into those broken down hovels that the white folks had moved out of and wouldn't stay in. We kind of inherited them. And then they still had to take what they had to build something. And so when the Restoration came, those same members of those same families were here with the Restoration, and those same family members, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren are here today. But if you look at the surnames, Bird and Lee and Tazewell, Telefarrell, Tolver, if you want to say it that way to make the distinction, Pierce, Tazewell, Canaday, Brown, Jones, they're all, Carter and Braxton, they're all here. So the black folks here and other places should really be up in arms trying to figure out and find out who you are. It's right there, just in your name. They either owned you or made you. And that's another story.
And Janice, I love the names that you just said, because in one word that most people actually never heard is called entwine. And if you think about it, remember, the entertainment was not by internet and television and radio back there.
It wasn't?
No, it wasn't. And
That's
so
something new, okay.
I always tell people, and my mother told me this, she said, son, don't say anything about anybody because you don't know who you're talking to.
Well, see, my granddaddy, James Wesley Brown, you know him as Y'all Brown.
Yeah?
He said, son, he knew I was a girl. He said, son, don't marry nobody here because everybody is your cousin. I used to always think he was joking.
Oh, yeah.
But as I start looking through my family lineage, people start popping up and say, that was
yes.
more truth than I knew it to be because I just wasn't smart enough to figure it out then, but now I know.
But then
what
if
he
you
said
look
is
at
true.
some people's facial structures and look at them and you look at this other person, you go, so that's when you learn.
Yeah.
It's one of the good reasons why I married a Williamsburg girl, but I'm not from here, so I didn't have that issue.
So we know definitely that there are the connections through the surnames, but some of the challenges we talked about, drawing a straight line can
Yeah.
be hard, but we definitely know that there is that connection there. Now, in our next segment, we're going to move into the 20th century. But first, we like to share some images of Colonial Williamsburg's Black community over time.
The Visual Resources collection housed in the John D Rockefeller Jr. Library encompasses visual documentation of the lives of African Americans in Williamsburg, Virginia, from the late 19th century through the more recent decades. The visual archives first began during the Restoration era, when the architectural team began assembling photographs of street scenes, structures, and landscapes to aid them in their research. As part of this process, they also assembled a collection that includes photographs that capture the daily activities of African Americans who lived along Duke of Gloucester Street, Francis Street, and Nicholson Street in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We have several examples of these photographs, including this one here that shows Samuel Harris's cheap store that was located at the corner of Botetourt and Duke of Gloucester Street. Samuel Harris was an African-American merchant who ran the mercantile until his death in 1904. There were a number of other African-American businesses along Duke of Gloucester Street, including the Crutchfield's Cafe and Barber Shop, which was in the approximate location of today's Brick House Tavern. As the restoration progressed, many churches, businesses, and residents had to be relocated to make room for the restoration progress. Several aerial photographs in the library's collection capture the changes that took place during this period. Several of them show a neighborhood that expanded and grew as some of the African American families were displaced and relocated to other parts of town. One is an aerial photograph by Frank Dementi, taken in 1934, and the other is an aerial photograph taken by a soldier, Robert Lowell Warner, during World War II around 1945 as part of an aerial photography training exercise. Both of these photographs show a group of white clapboard houses that were located along Scotland Street that were built by Colonial Williamsburg for both displaced residents and for African Americans who they were trying to incentivize to come in to work in the hotels and restaurants at Colonial Williamsburg. This new row of houses joined a neighborhood that included the James City County Training School, which was a school for African Americans that opened in 1924 at the corner of Nicholson and Botetourt Streets. The neighborhood also included several restaurants, the Samaritan Oddfellows Hall, where there was an indoor basketball court, a playing field, and 2 churches, Union Baptist Church and Mount Ararat Church. The library is fortunate to have the collection of Albert Durant. He was the first city-licensed African-American photographer in Williamsburg, and he graduated from the James City County Training School, so spent quite a bit of time in this neighborhood, which came to be known as White City because of the row of 6 white clapboard houses built by Colonial Williamsburg. We are fortunate to have photographs from Albert Durant's high school photo album that capture much of student life at the training school, ranging from sporting events, class exercises and assemblies, and graduations. Albert Durant would return as an adult to the neighborhood to photograph business owner Ernest Wallace and his employees who operated the Hillside Cafe and Beer Garden located off of Raleigh Lane. The internal photographic archive created by Colonial Williamsburg's official photographers also serves a dual purpose of commemorating the lives of African Americans in Williamsburg and their contributions to Colonial Williamsburg. African Americans worked in a variety of roles in the early decades at Colonial Williamsburg, ranging from excavators at archaeological sites, brick masons, and carpenters at the restoration sites, hospitality workers, landscapers, and costume attendants at the exhibition buildings. Some of them also formed singing groups, such as the Williamsburg Quintet, which entertained guests at the Williamsburg Inn and Lodge and even produced their own record in 1950. Fleming Brown, who is pictured in this photograph, worked as the major domo at the governor's palace, and he portrayed the head steward on the governor's domestic staff beginning in the late 1940s through the 1950s, and he greeted hundreds of guests, cared for the historic interiors, and also explained the furnishings to guests along with some of the tour leaders. He was joined by several African American women who worked out in the governor's palace kitchen and also interacted with guests and cared for the furnishings. Together, these groups of photos throughout the decades celebrate the lives of Williamsburg's African Americans over time and flesh out their stories, showing that their lives are important and matter, and documenting their efforts despite many obstacles to move forward in their circumstances and also help their city. The Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and the John D Rockefeller Jr. Library are proud to be the repository of important photo collections such as the Albert Durant Photography Collection, and we are committed to preserving and providing access to these vital resources that help document the experience of Williamsburg's Black community. But we can do more to give voice to the people depicted by harnessing the power of community memory to identify the individuals, places, and events portrayed in these photos. Many of the images in the Albert Durant Photography Collection have limited or no identification information. The Foundation will soon undertake a project to fill in gaps in our information, and we will be inviting community partners to participate and help flesh out the stories of Williamsburg's African American residents. More details will be available soon.
Welcome back to us, past, present, and future CW Conversation. We're going to continue our discussion about the Black community in Williamsburg by moving into the time of living memory to talk about the establishment of Colonial Williamsburg and how that affected Williamsburg Black residents, as well as Williamsburg in the Civil Rights era. Colonial Williamsburg restoration had an impact on the Black community. Now, curious to know, did Black and white Williamsburgers live together or were they segregated during this period?
Well, blacks and whites were living together in communities together. It wasn't so much an issue as the issue that it will become after a period of time. And that's usually that would have happened when those black folks are starting to rise up and to accomplish and getting level with those folks that didn't want to be level with them, looking eyeball to eyeball. So you're making too much gain. Let's see what we can do to change things and slow you down a little bit. So that in itself was a deliberate thing. But these were people who were going to the same markets, participating in some of the same businesses, patronizing black businesses, that type of thing, gathering together in certain spots and socializing. And that wasn't an issue. They kind of blurred the lines. But they got only but so close, but you just had to know. You could survive and be here, but you just had to know when to stop and when it was time for you to get back in your place and don't cross that place. And folks knew that. So you were tolerated, so to speak. But there were black folks who knew exactly how to play it the way they needed to get where they needed to go. So they used that mother wit that they had that came from their descendants.
Yeah. Now, John D. Rockefeller Jr., he was instrumental in the restoration of the 18th century buildings in Williamsburg. This was a time when Rockefeller was the wealthiest man in America. What was his relationship like with Williamsburg residents, especially in the beginning when he was buying up property anonymously?
You know, they didn't. Black folks didn't trust him. They didn't know exactly what to think, because everybody lived here in Williamsburg but experienced it differently. They experienced everything here differently. For the white folks, they were dealt with one way by Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Goodwin, and black folks, it was a totally different thing. They were having their displaced from their property. Being forced off of it because they didn't have the money to get representation to make sure they got a fair deal, where white folks could probably do that a lot easier. But white folks naturally were going to be dealt with differently because Goodwin looked at them differently. He didn't see black folks as being totally human, and he didn't have a whole lot of regard for them one way or the other, based on things that I read that he said. How, the white folks were being displaced, but being given money for their property, given true value or better value than the black folks were being given, and sometimes given temporary housing. They helped to resettle them, relocate them. Black folks didn't get any of that. You had to take whatever they gave you, take it and go. And the irony of it is that these black folks, even after they moved, well, what do you do? Where are you going to go to? And how do you start over again and resettle yourself? So those same people had to suck it up and decide, I want to move my family forward. I can't leave and go anywhere. Where am I going to go? You're going to find some of the same stuff wherever you go. So I think about those people and the pride that they had to swallow and come to Colonial Williamsburg, to the foundation, become a part of the restoration and apply for jobs here. And even when they got the jobs from the people who moved them out or displaced them, they still did their best. They still thrived and they still created. So I think that's amazing in itself.
Wow.
And also to segue into that, that's where my grandfather actually built in the way, what they call it now, the west end of Williamsburg, a cornfield. He bought a large plot in the cornfield, built a house there, and built and financed the houses for people there.
Wow.
And that's, which I thought, personally, I did not know that growing up. I just thought, as a child and even as a young adult, oh, okay, I guess we're just living here, And then I found out, wait a minute, he never said anything.
Yeah.
And that's also, and I'm just going to let that segue into another problem that we've been discussing too, is how most of our people just haven't told us some of the actual good things and some of the bad things that we should hear. But they thought that just be quiet, boy, just sit there.
Now, what about Abby Aldridge Rockefeller? What was her role in building Brewton Heights School?
Well, Abby was the one that had that gave the most money.
Oh, wow.
But just remember that it wasn't just Abby Aldridge that gave money. There was the state, a little bit. There was the city, a little bit. And there was also the actual black people that were attending it. There is documentation that shows that black people actually raised a lot of money in the building of the school, which we're actually sitting in right now. And Abby was the one that not only built this school, but little known is that she gave scholarships, full scholarships, to 2 schools, Matthew Paley and this one. And there was no delta difference. There was no delta between the two. And there were scholarships that were in total, which is even very unusual. And now a total scholarship. I guess that stopped when the school was desegregated.
Well, thank you, Bobby. That leads right into our next question. We've spoken about how Brewton Heights was built as a segregated school for Black students. But what was the experience of the community? So this is students, this is parents, this is teachers during the desegregation of public schools in Williamsburg.
Well, this school was an extension of your community. It was community. When you came here, it didn't matter what your situation was at home, your needs would be met when you got here. A lot of the teachers, the office administrators, the secretary in the office, maybe sometimes even the principal, the librarian, they lived in your neighborhoods. They shopped where you shopped. They attended your church, and they knew you. They knew your family. If you didn't know who you were, they could tell you who you were and how you were to behave. And they knew that they had the full support of your parents. And it wasn't a thing where you came here wondering what you were going to do or if you were going to succeed. They told you, and they expected it. You know, so they had a partnership in the community and with your parents and with you. And so this was a place not just where you were educated, you were socialized here. This is your theater, your community place to, you know, to operate and show plays and have programs and things. This is where you got your inoculations, you saw the dentist, whatever you needed, it was here. Community needs were taken care of right here. So this really was just a carryover of your community. It was a
Janice, I'm
wonderful
glad
place.
you said that, because one thing I totally forgot about is Dr. McCampbell. And Dr. McCampbell, this is where we're sitting now is the auditorium, and right next door used to be the gym, and in the back there was an office, and that's where the dentist was. I don't know if he was there when you were there, but we had doctors, we had a nurse, and we had a dentist, which took it, and if you went into the lobby here, you would see some pictures of that, which I'd totally almost forgotten about.
So with desegregation, something was lost, not just for the students.
Oh, a lot was
but
lost.
for the entire community. And I just want to bring up a story that Bobby shared with us as we were speaking earlier, that when these schools were being desegregated, this school specifically, when white students were going to be coming here, all of these trophies, banners, awards were just discarded. They were thrown away. And Bobby, can you speak to how we ended up with the ones we do have today that are preserved here?
Well, yes, and I'll mention his name because unfortunately he is dead. He was our phys ed teacher, and his name was Rule Blair. And I heard when I came back, because I was gone then, that he actually climbed into the dumpster to pull out as many of the trophies he could that were in the trophy case. And I had to admit that one really kind of hurt me. But
Yeah.
But you know what that is? That's no appreciation for the culture or for the people. The value never being assigned by the other folks. They never see you as being worthy of remembrance. Your story doesn't matter, and they're not thinking about saving it, you know, just moving you out the way. That's like Dr. Goodwin, his thing was if he could remove the African Americans and they would just leave Williamsburg, that would solve his problem. So that's a carryover of that same idea, that same way of thinking.
exactly, and our teachers tried their best to make sure that we did well when we left and out into the world. And by that I mean our teachers came to work in suits and ties and long dresses. And you had no problem understanding when you were supposed to be in class, what you were going to do in that class, your homework, you better do that homework. You better not fight. And it was and I thought about it, and a cigarette, If he actually found out, I think half the town would know that you smoked cigarettes. And there was no way. But you, oh, and I understand this was in other areas too of, for black people, is that the discipline came from various factors. First, if you did something wrong, the teacher got you. If it was really kind of not that good, the principal got you. As you went home, the neighbors got you. And by the time you got home,
Nothing
your
left
mama
again.
got you. And what were the most dreaded words a child could ever hear? Just wait till your father comes home. Oh my goodness.
Well,
So,
actually,
oh no, and so when you went back to school the next day, oh, you studied so well.
well, this kind of segues into the next question. We want to talk about some of your personal experiences and how you've done well and succeeded. But Bobby, you campaigned and you were elected to city council. How did the changes in town help or hinder you in that endeavor?
How did, oh my. Phew. Well, one of the changes, you had to remember when I lived here. I lived here for, 12 years. 1 to 12. Well, when I became, the first 2 weeks I became a city councilman, I got a call from William and Mary, from a gentleman who worked for the provost, I believe, and asked me, would I come over and let them tell me a few things about the interface between the city and William and Mary and what they perceived the whole bit. I said, absolutely. So I went over, went to sit down. They were getting ready to make the presentation. And I said, whoa, just a minute. There's one thing you need to know. What's that? So you do understand I've never set foot on William and Mary's campus.
Wow.
And they looked at me as if, wait a minute, oh, I never had a need.
Yeah.
That was one. But let's go back in time to the other one. Do you know when, to me, this is just to me, our first click of integration, you know where it was? High's Ice Cream. And I'm sure some of the audience is going, wait a minute. Well, High's Ice Cream came to town. Well, we had a Howard Johnson's, as I said, was over on Duke of Gloucester Street. From what I remember, High's Ice Cream put Howard Johnson almost out of business as far as ice cream was concerned. Now, how did this have, what was the impact here? Well, High's Ice Cream didn't have any seats. There were no chairs. Everybody had to stand in line. And if on a summer's day, hardly any air conditioning was not, pervasive. Everybody stood in line.
Wow.
Now, I'd like to ask you, Brian, how the work of people like Bobby affect you? Like, what do you think about these trailblazers that have come before you?
Sure. So I'm not ashamed that, I stand on the shoulders of giants. People like, Mr. Braxton here and other folks in this community. I'm not going to start naming names because, look, I don't want anybody coming after me because I didn't name their uncle or cousin. But, there's so many people that really kind of paved the way for me to be able to be an attorney here in this town, to be a business owner in this town. And so I tip my hat to folks like Bobby, because the reality is but for people like him, they paved the way. And so it made the journey that much easier for my generation.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Ms. Janice, I'd like to know what changes you have seen, compared with prior generations of your family.
There have been changes. Like Ryan says, else we wouldn't be sitting here.
Sure.
And I don't want to be a naysayer. There have definitely been changes, but not enough. So I
Yeah,
guess I'm going to be
absolutely.
the one in this room that keeps bringing that up. But my children were able to experience this town in a different way. Whereas I didn't come to Colonial Williamsburg. My stepfather worked here. And he worked for the restoration, that's what he called it. So other than holidays, we didn't come here. Might have walked around it, but didn't come through it. But we knew it was here. But my children, I immersed my children here. Even when my mother used to say, what you take them down there for? Because I could hear her say that now. Because they weren't old enough to work, she felt like they weren't old enough to work this, so what you going down there for? There's nothing there for you. But I felt like there was everything here. I knew I didn't know the things that I should have known, and I knew there was a lot here, and I wanted my children to find it. So I brought my children here, starting with Adam when he was 6 years old. And you know that story, and he's still here and will be 33 next month. But he
Lord.
found his history, and he found himself, and so it drew his brothers and sisters here. So they came here and they learned who they were and whose they were. They were educated by great folks like Emily James and Kathleen Getward and Rose McAfee, folks like that helped them, gave them little nuggets for them to grab hold of. And they fell in love with Rockefeller Library, learned how to do research. Adam went to school and challenged the teachers. He said, you know, Black History Month, well, let me tell you what we need to talk about. Because I went to school a lot because of him coming here, you know, and backing him up. But they learned that they were much more than what was being told to them, and that there was nothing that held them back but them. And so the experience that most Black folks didn't get here, my children did get here. And I have to believe that the successes that they're having now is deeply rooted in what they got by being immersed at Colonial Williamsburg and learning that African American people have always been successful, always participated. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ms. Janice. We now have a few questions from members of our audience. I'd like to start with Bianca. She would like to know, how has gentrification impacted the Black community in Williamsburg?
That's a strong question.
In the same way it's affected other places, it's happening around you all the time.
Gentrification.
But you know what? What's amazing is, not to take away from it, but because our younger folks don't realize the value of what the elders leave behind, that's how other folks tend to slip in and get it, because they see the value. You know, you might have someone that passes away and has a house and some land, and the house could be in disrepair, but it's sitting on land. And if you know how hard it was for our folks to get land and education, they knew that was the key. So when you look at that broken down house that you might not want to stay in and what it represents, the generations that come through, your history is there. So for nothing else, take the land and what's in it. They gave you a leg up with that. So if we don't see the value, it's easy for gentrification to happen because people just want to get rid of it. I don't want it. You know, I don't care what they do. Just give me a little something. But what they give you does not equal to the lifetime of work that your folks put there. So until we start telling the stories and teaching our children where the real value is, other folks will always take advantage of us. Always.
When we talk about gentrification,
Yes.
the triangle comes to mind. That was, and to make sure that the audience understands what that was area in Williamsburg. There was a self-sufficient Black area that was actually torn down and done by the, oh my goodness, who was it? Williamsburg, not restoration. Phooey, I've lost it. But
Go on with your story.
what is?
Yeah, you right. It'll come back to you in a little bit. Just blurt it out.
Federal program that revitalized the triangle block.
But they took the businesses
Yeah,
away.
they took all they took the businesses and put what they considered to be viable businesses. And if you look at it now, well, I don't think it really turned out that well. But I'm so sorry I had a loss at the word of the name of the agency.
Well, actually, Pam in our audience would like to know about some of the businesses that were there in the Triangle before, it was purchased or repurposed or however that happened.
You want me to do
Yeah,
that?
tell them about
Sure,
Clarence
yeah.
Webb's store and
Oh, wow.
Mr. Blake.
Well, in the apex of the triangle was Jimmy Williams Restaurant, and you'd go around, as you'd go around counterclockwise, it would be Mr. Webb's store, which he sold everything from kerosene to bread to meats to
Wow.
everything in the smallest store you had ever seen.
He was Walmart before it was
I know.
Walmart. Right?
Yes, he was.
He also cashed checks, and he was one man.
Wow.
Next to him was the blacksmith shop, and the blacksmith shop was run by Mr. Sam Harris, not the same Harris that we've talked about, the chief store, another one. And Dr. Blayton bought that land and built the Blayton Hospital.
Wow.
Going next to the hospital was Mr. Gary's Cleaners. And Mr. Gary did a lot of work and business with William and Mary. And moving on to the corner was Earl Henderson's electric shop.
Wow.
And coming around, we had houses where, people live. People live.
The Johnsons.
Yeah. And across the street was Mr. Henry Billups, whom was a bell ringer at William and Mary, who's rather famous in that area. Coming around, there was the barber shop and the fish man, who had a truck on the street every Saturday morning, and we never missed that. My mother would always give me $1 to buy fish, and it actually fed us for 2 days.
Wow.
And it was the best fish you ever had.
Fresh out the water.
Oh, my goodness, it was wonderful.
So just this amazing, thriving community.
And they actually did have a Black Expo on the Triangle Block a few years in a row. Remember?
When was that?
You might not have been here. There
No, I
was a
wasn't
Black
here.
Expo. Yeah, I
You got
remember
me.
that. Collectively, artists and people, vendors would come there and right in that little strip,
Yeah.
that triangle strip we would have in the summer. We would have an expo out there, and we would collect there in a crowd. So it didn't last too long.
Well, thank you so much for that, and thank you, our guests watching, for those questions. Now that we have discussed our past and our present, let us turn to our future. As a community, what are we looking for and what are we still trying to gain? I'll start with you, Brian.
Wow. I think that, it's been talked about. We've come a long way, but there is so much more to the story that needs to be told. I mean, I think that, we sell ourselves short. And what we have to realize and understand, not just here in Williamsburg, but in our entire country, collectively, this is our history.
Yeah.
It's who we are, the good, the bad, the ugly, okay? And it's just one of those things where we have to be willing to have tough conversations, because that's going to allow us to be able to, to move forward. We need to know history, okay? Because I think as you learn history, it empowers people to let them know that, you are more than capable. Most of the Black history I got was through a program that we had here with the area churches called the Black History Quiz Bowl. And they would give us a binder about this thick with all kinds of Black history facts. And each of the area churches had their own teams. I'm proud to report that my team at First Baptist Church was 2-time back-to-back champions, but we won't go there too much. But as a result of that time, I learned a lot. And so now the onus is on us as a community, as a people. When I say a people, I'm not just talking about Black people, I'm talking about all people in this community, to realize and recognize the importance of our collective history. And we can move ahead and we can make strides when it comes to healthcare, education, housing, if we are willing to acknowledge some of the issues that were there in the past many of them still existing today. And if we can just, continue to just kind of grow, as a people together, I just think that we'll find, what we're looking for moving forward.
And what about Colonial Williamsburg? How does Colonial Williamsburg need to act differently in the future?
They don't need to act. Colonial Williamsburg needs to be differently in the future. So we need to build bridges. We need to embrace our history, as Brian said, because it's all of our history.
Yeah.
And we need to embrace the African American community and that part of the story, because it's all connected together. So we need to create a new tapestry. The one we had, it's done what it's supposed to do. Time to move on. We need to recreate a tapestry that embraces everybody and everybody's story, and not leave it, a half-told history is half-told history. And so we might live in different neighborhoods, but we're all part of the same community. And the pandemic that we're going through right now should teach us that. You might have a yacht, and I might have a boat, and somebody else might have a bucket, but we're all in the same boat now, buddy, so we all need the same thing. So it doesn't matter who you are or where you came from. We're still here, and to survive, it's going to be a collective effort. We have to help each other. So I'm going to only be as powerful and as secure as you are.
Sure.
You have to care about me, and I have to care about you. We have to tell those stories for the generations that come behind us. They have to have something to hold on to pull themselves up with. And so if we don't give them their truth, what are they going to do?
Okay. And lastly, would you say that our experiences here in Williamsburg have a lot in common with communities across the nation?
I would. I mean, while there are certain things that may be unique from a geographical standpoint or just because of, who we are, I mean, I think the reality is that throughout this country, we all go through, have been through, and will continue to go through things. And we're very similar in nature. So,
Common humanity.
Common humanity, absolutely. And so, Williamsburg, while it's a unique place, I think many of the stories, many of the things that we've talked about here today are true in other communities as well. And so we just have to realize, that is the case. And we can grow and we can get better collectively together.
And Williamsburg to me is different, really. In many ways it is different. And I guess I saw that when I came back, because if I may have a little time just to say this one story, but when I left Williamsburg in 1956, I told my mother, I said, Mom, there's no way I'm ever coming back here. All you all do is go to church, stay in church the whole time, and I have to get up and go and do this and do that. I said, I'm tired of it. I said, there's absolutely no way I'm going to come back here. It's a dead town, and I have nothing to say. Okay, 25 years later, I told my mother, hi, I'm a trustee at the church in Columbia. My mother just looked at me, and the look that a mother gives a son without saying anything, it says, I told you so. Okay. And when I came back to run in Williamsburg, it was done because the Williamsburg Housing Authority, I finally thought of the name.
Yeah,
The Williamsburg Housing Authority was going to revamp my area. And I said, well, now, this seems to be a time I could actually come in and help and move it along a little bit. And I did. And that's when I made the decision to run for city council. And that's when I found out that the people in Williamsburg were really quite nice. As I said, I walked the whole town, and everybody does it, runs for city council. I walked the whole town, knocked on every door, and there was only one person that was mean. And the only reason he was mean because he was working in the garden and things were not going well for him, and I caught him at the wrong time.
Well, thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Miss Janice. That's all the time we have today. We hope we've given you some thoughts and ideas for some action in your own communities. Please join us for next month's CW Conversation, A Woman's Place, on March 20th. We'd like to thank you so much for joining us, and we would like to send a special thank you to our donors. Without them, programs like this wouldn't be possible. Thank you again, and have a good evening.